I wanted to talk about the Aptera and how much I think it'll have going for it as a potential road tripping EV. Now, I know some of you guys are a bit skeptical that they'll even make it to production, and there's certainly some open questions right now as to what motor they're even going to use. But for the sake of argument, let's assume they go full steam ahead and hit all the specs that they advertise. I wanted to compare the Launch Edition Aptera to my own Tesla Model 3 and a real-life road trip I've done and see how the Aptera would have done by comparison. And the first place we have to start is with the charging speed. The Aptera has a 50 kilowatt peak charging speed, which doesn't sound like a lot, but because of how efficient the Aptera is, it's probably not as slow as you think. Doing some rough napkin math, that works out to be roughly 765 kilometers of range added back in per hour. And for point of comparison, my LFP Model 3 has a peak charging speed of 170 kilowatts, which does work out to be more at 1,241 kilometers an hour. However, the Model 3 does not hold that peak charging speed very far at all into the charging curve, and it very quickly starts slowing down as it gets deeper into the charge. Whereas with the Aptera, I suspect it'll keep that 50 kilowatts pretty deep into the charge. We'll have to revisit this in the future. That means that if you get stuck on a slower 50 kilowatt station or a derated station, it's not going to affect you at all, unlike a really large, really fast charging EV would. And because the Aptera is so efficient, even if you were to charge on a level 2 6.6 kilowatt J1772 station, that still works out to be 101 kilometers of range added back in per hour, which is perfect if you're stopping somewhere for a longer lunch or a longer rest on a road trip. And again, to compare to my Model 3 would only get 48 kilometers of range per hour on that same station. The Aptera gets literally over twice as much. Even if you were to plug in an Aptera to a standard wall outlet, that still equates to 18 kilometers of range added per hour. As for what chargers you can use, you'll have access to pretty much everything. It'll have a NACS port natively built into it, so you can use Tesla Superchargers that support it, but you can also use CCS stations with just an adapter. And the Aptera's efficiency also translates into the road trips being cheaper as well. Last year, I took my Model 3 on a road trip from Toronto to Halifax and back. That was 3,526 kilometers total distance for a total of $304 Canadian spent charging there and back on superchargers. And if we do a bit of math, comparing the Model 3's watt hours per kilometer to the Aptera's, you can see that it roughly uses only 48% of the energy that the Model 3 does to cover the same amount of distance. And if we apply that to the total cost that I spent charging on that trip, all other things being equal, that same road trip in the Aptera would have only cost $145 in charging. And that's not even taking into consideration the 700 watts of solar adorning the Aptera, which can add, in peak sunlight conditions, up to 64 kilometers of range per day. Now, on a road trip, 90 to 95% of your driving is going to be highways, and on my road trip, autopilot was a very huge benefit and just made the miles go by so much easier. And the Aptera will also have its own ADAS system in the form of OpenPilot, which has a really, really high rating. As I always like to remind people, the Aptera is not a small vehicle. It's actually just as big as my Model 3, but because it's only a two-seater, the rest of that space can be used for cargo, whatever you want to fit back there, so you have no shortage of cargo space. And another misconception that some people have is that the Aptera is slow, which also is not the case. If you stomp on that accelerator, that thing gets up and goes, which can be really useful for positioning yourself in traffic and when making lane changes especially. And it's definitely not slow in the top speed either. It has a top speed of 177 kilometers an hour. So I know the Aptera looks funny, but if you look past that and look at just the specs, this thing actually seems like it's going to be a road tripping machine. And I'm really looking forward to getting mine because I want to show everything that this thing will be capable of. I want to actually take it out on some crazy road trips, like around Canada or something like that. And just beating the absolute crap out of it and seeing what it's capable of as an adventure vehicle.